Okay, we've got a recording back on. Let me set this to speaker view. All right. We're coming online. Shall we be on time?
Yes.
All right.
So we're
Susan, why don't you
starting.
start us off?
Okay. Well, I want to welcome everybody to an adult education presentation this evening by Professor Steven Windmueller. You'll have a full introduction in just a moment or so. But I know that this is a kind of a hot topic, and people will have questions as you listen to Professor Windmueller. So we'd like to have you put your questions in the chat, and we'll monitor them and then bring them up at the end of the presentation. But I know we're all eager to hear what Professor Windmueller has to say. I want to let Rabbi Kahana do the formal introduction. So why don't you go ahead, Rabbi?
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you to the Adult Education Committee that Susan chairs, a very thoughtful group, and we're really grateful for all of the work that all of the members do. We have a singular honor today to welcome Dr. Steven Windmueller, who is a emeritus professor of Jewish communal studies at Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles. I was not fortunate enough to be a student of Dr. Windmueller's because I didn't go to the LA campus, but Rabbi Joseph did, or at least had some opportunity to study with him. We did have an opportunity, and we were talking about this just before we began. Dr. Windmueller came and spoke to our congregation immediately after a presidential election in 2016. And at that presentation, he was talking about how did the Jewish vote, all that happened there. It was we had planned to have him brought in. I think no one really expected, as we recall back in the day, what 2016 was like in November of that time, the bit of shock that everyone was in. So coincidentally, he is here again, immediately following a presidential election in which we are looking towards a Trump administration. And Dr. Windmueller just shared with us that after 2016, he wrote a book on the subject. So you might want to show us that book, and others might be interested in looking for that in the future about the Jewish vote in the Trump administration. But Dr. Windmueller has been with Hebrew Union College for quite a long time. Before then, he was on the staff of the American Jewish Committee, directed the Albany, New York Jewish Federation and the JCRC of the Los Angeles Jewish Federation, all very important institutions. Dr. Windmueller served for 10 years as the director of Hebrew Union College's School of Jewish Nonprofit Management. And in 2005, he was named the Dean of the Los Angeles campus, which he held until 2010. In 2009, he was named to an endowed chair, and in 2014, awarded an honorary doctorate by Hebrew Union College to go along with his professional PhD in international relations from the University of Pennsylvania. His research has been primarily focused on Jewish communal trends. And I lost my, excuse me, I'm sorry.
If you want, Rabbi, I can fill in for you.
No, that's all right. You shouldn't have to introduce yourself. His research primarily focused on Jewish communal trends, anti-Semitism, Jewish political behavior, and his articles have appeared in a number of secular and Jewish publications. He's currently consulting with national agencies, federations, synagogues, and foundations in connection with his current studies on virtual and privatized Judaism, the impact of COVID, and the broader social, economic, and political trends that are reshaping American Jewish life. I can think of no better person in the country to have to speak to us today on reflections over what this past year has been, reflections on October 7th and beyond, and reimagining community in the 21st century. Dr. Windmueller.
Well, thank you, Rabbi, and thank you to Susan as well for arranging this evening, and good evening to all of you. At this point, Susan, if we could bring up the PowerPoint, that would be great, and we would have the opportunity to walk through some of the core issues of this evening's conversation about really the implications of the Gaza conflict and what it may mean for us and for world Jewry and certainly for Israel.
That is coming imminent.
There we go. So for sure, this moment is particularly important for us in realizing that this is the 408th day of this conflict, and with 101 hostages remaining in the control of Hamas. And with it, we also understand our own emotions and reactions, even at times frustrations with all that has and is unfolding. So let's move to the next slide, please. Here I want to point out that the scene here is of a smashed Jewish symbol, simply reminding us of the extraordinary tragedy and trauma of what occurred on the 7th of October, 2023. And no doubt, while this event was definitively about Israelis and the Israeli-Palestinian issues, it has become very much a part of American Jewry and has certainly shaped the relationship between Washington and Jerusalem over these past 2 years. And in so much of this conversation will be about not only our personal, but our collective reflections of what all of this may mean, but also the implications that it has with the larger issues of Iran and Israel and the general state of the Middle East at this time. Let's go to the next slide. I think we have come to understand that this conflict has evolved in stages, and we would remind ourselves that in 2 days from now, we will observe the 1-year anniversary of the gathering in Washington on November 14th of this past year, where literally 290,000 of our fellow Jews gathered, and maybe some of us, in this effort to affirm the solidarity and unity that exists between the Jewish people, Israel, and global Jewry. In reality, the events of that past year have begun to unravel. And I say that with a particular note that this past Sunday in Washington, D.C., a rally was convened by the Jewish Federations of North America and the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations, including our own Union for Reform Judaism. It was garnered to draw initially 30,000. It was then anticipated that 12,000 would attend. And in reality, the Washington, D.C. police informed us that about 2,000 people actually showed up. The commentary here is that while the numbers were small, we realized that this was an extraordinary week, not only for American Jews, but for Americans in the context of the election. We were also reminded that but a few days ago in Amsterdam, Jews in the public square were attacked. And all of this together has created the sense of uncertainty and even a degree of fear on the part of some with regard to the convening of large crowds of folks on behalf of Israel and the Jewish people. So that event certainly is a kind of indicator of the deepening and clear points of separation between a year ago and now. And I would point one other factor out. I would share with you that there were a group of 3 major national Jewish organizations that announced that they would not participate on the November 10th event in Washington. And these groups, all defining themselves as progressives, including the New Israel Fund, American Friends of Peace Now, and Truah, the rabbinic voice for peace, elected to not participate and formally indicated as such. But beyond that moment, I think it's important that we talk about the extraordinary events that have occurred, including the single largest efforts on the part of the Jewish people to raise funds in support of Israel, its needs of its people, its military operations. This was distinctively a different kind of fundraising, even though it was the greatest amounts ever raised and contributed to Jewish causes for Israel, certainly surpassing 1973 and 1967, and garnering a significant degree of response, precisely because it was not one campaign, but it was a series of national and international Jewish groups that raised money in the ability to garner as much of a resource base as possible. So, for example, we noticed that the Israel Trauma Center, as well as the Israel Red Cross, as well as a host of other institutions beyond our federations, were able to raise significant and groundbreaking dollars in the context of the events from last October into early parts of 2024. We also noted something rather extraordinary, what is referred to here as the return, but what others have referenced as the shift. What we have seen is a significant body of American Jews who are not affiliated with institutions such as our synagogues, our federations, and our other national organizations that have, in a sense, come home. Whether the events of October 7th or the follow-up activities of anti-Semitic, anti-Israel behaviors would drive this is still unclear. And the depth and degree of this return remains still in play. But congregations, federations, and day schools are reporting to us the significant realities of folks seeking connection, information, and identity with the Jewish communities. But no doubt our kids would be the centerpiece, and more clearly in March and April of this past year, where we would see on 147 university campuses attacks on Jewish students and attacks directed against Israel. This would be an extraordinarily important moment for our young people because it would also create some interesting and challenging counterpoints, meaning we received a significant number of letters compiled and written by young American Jews on college campuses, directed to their parents, directed to their former institutions, to their rabbis and congregations, indicating a kind of disconnect. For some young American Jews, Israel's actions in the events that followed October 7th were seen as out of bounds. They questioned Zionism. They questioned the ways in which they were taught about Israel. They questioned Zionist education. And they challenged us on the basis that this was not the Israel that we spoke about in terms of Tikkun Olam. This was not the Israel that we were promised or that they felt they had been promised. So indeed, that is a storyline that continues, and we will need to delve more deeply into its full contextual outcomes. No question has risen more distinctively and significantly is the fact that 93% of American Jews in a Pew Foundation poll indicated that they today believe that anti-Semitism is more real and more demanding and threatening to them than at any point in their lifetimes. And this is borne out by a variety of other factors that we will explore in a few moments. But at the same moment, the poetry, the music, the art, the literature of both dealing with this moment of the 7th of October, but the fear and the realities of where Israel would find itself after the 7th, would create this extraordinary cultural revolution of defining ways by which Jews, both here and in Israel, could articulate what they were feeling and how they were behaving. And also, we would note that many of our historic allies and traditional friends were absent. When we turned and looked around on the 7th and 8th of October of last year, they were not to be found. And this was a profound and shocking impact on American Jewish community relations, and was a moment of significant transformation for us in terms of how we would understand this conflict and the behaviors of those who had once declared themselves as allies and friends. I think the significant effect on American Jewish communal and religious life has been this profound sense of both a fear and expectation. The fear associated with the amount of hate that we have experienced and that we know is present, the expectation of the outcome here of an end to this conflict, of the return of the hostages, of some kind of closure to this moment. That has yet to come. Let's go to the next slide. There was, as I suggest, a period of time in which we would come together, and no better moment was that 14th of November of last year. But what we have seen beyond that is a sense of our loneliness, both as individuals, but also in households and amongst friends, in the context that many people differed and disagreed associated with this conflict. In fact, we have some data from various studies which suggest to us that for young American Jews, 47% of them, that's nearly one half of young Jews 18 to 35, reported that they stopped talking to people in their lives who disagreed with them around this war, who were on Facebook or on other social media platforms critical or attacking them and Israel, or other factors that would lead to the divide and distancing that young Jews in particular felt. But even beyond young Jews, we would find that a significant number of American Jews in general reported that there were periods of time at which the Shabbat table or the Seder table or the gatherings of people together as a community were in part shattered or weakened by the divisions around this conflict and about challenging conversations having to do with politics and Israel. And indeed, the political divide was deep, not only with regard to this conflict amongst and between Jews, but this would bleed over into the 2024 election as well. In so many different ways, some of us believe that Zionism itself was on trial, especially on the part of young progressive Jews who were challenging us around the questions of what the Zionist message ought to have been. Let's move forward. I think we would see on our college campuses the emergence of two organizations that were clearly perceived as outside of the boundaries of dissent. Jewish Voices for Palestine, and If Not Now, would become two organizations that would galvanize Jewish participants and others in clearly demarcating a kind of division within the college communities over folks who were defenders of Israel, or at least sitting inside the tent being supportive of Israel, even as they may have criticized some of Israeli actions and policies. But with JVP and If Not Now, we had two groups that stood outside of that. And one such demonstration is pictured here. It takes place in New York's train station at Penn Station, and it is a kind of a definition of the kinds of public displays by groups who were both critical as well as in support.
Grand Central Station.
Grand Central, my apologies. The generational reality here is maybe the hot story, the real story of what we are experiencing. And here, of course, we described earlier the divisions we were seeing with younger Jews. We believe about 7%, up to 12% of young American Jews have been publicly active or defining themselves as sort of sitting outside of the Israel tent at this point, struggling with Zionism and questioning Israeli policy, questioning, of course, US policy, and reflective, of course, in how they at times saw the campaign of Donald Trump and Vice President Harris in terms of expressing their unhappiness with the Biden administration over support of Israel and being unable and frustrated in terms of how to vote when they felt they had no place to go. So what we would see is a 1 to 2% turnout of some of these voters for third-party candidates, including Jill Stein, whose platform was clearly hostile to Israel and who would galvanize some of those voters in her camp. I think that we will live for a while and maybe for a generation with this fallout. The question is, will some of these folks come home? Will there be a way to reintroduce the Israel questions and conversations with them? Or whether, as one rabbi has recently described, do we face a lost generation of Jews around this war? The next slide, please. I think what we have seen in more graphic ways is the kind of disconnects that have really allowed us to struggle with folks around this conflict, associated more directly with some of the physical attacks, the ideological labeling, the discounting, if you wish, of Jews, and the notion, are Jews white? And I put that in play because those on the far left, as well as on the far right, have begun to raise that issue in a context of belief that this is the core question about the status of Jews, not only as an outcome of the conflict in Israel and with Hamas, but in their American journey as well. For the far right, the notion is that Jews will not replace us, which was the line in Charlottesville in 2017. In that context, Jews were seen as trying to take power and become white. For the far left and the postmodernists, it's the idea that Jews are already white and have become powerful and have, in a sense, assumed leadership, and therefore are Zionists, are colonialists, are racist by definition, because as whites, they are classified as in having power and thereby automatically being defined by postmodernist ideology as racist in behavior. So I think that this has become a huge question that has really torn apart the political extremes in this country. What we have also begun to see is an interesting behavior on the part of some Jews who are today critical of established Jewish leadership and feel that the Jewish community did not adequately anticipate what we would see after the 7th of October, did not understand the impact of such groups that were pursuing intersectionality, critical race theory, and cancel culture, did not understand nor fully absorb the changing demographic realities of this country. And so there is, for the first time in the post-war period, a significant degree of sharp criticism at established Jewish leadership and organizations, something that really is reflective of this moment that we had not anticipated. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to step back here because this is a slide that simply reminds us of the complexity of the American Jewish community that we are living in and what kinds of institutions we're talking about. Really, there are two sets. The legacy institutions, which are denominations and our federated agencies. They are the historic base of the American Jewish community. The national organizations are part of that world, and all of these institutions have thrived in the period of being effective at responding to crisis, dealing with a core agenda that integrated basic principles of Jewish political practice, and that these were highly networked, meaning tied together either by cross linkages of leadership or tied together by shared and common cause. What has emerged since the 1980s has been the arrival of all of these unique single issue groups. And I've already referenced a few of them tonight. Some of them will be more poignant as we move forward. But these are groups that have come into play that have appealed to single issue focus of many American Jews, whether it's Israel, but Israel through a particular lens, whether it's J Street, or whether it's the New Israel Fund, or whether it is a host of groups dealing with environmental issues, or concerned about other kinds of religious, spiritual, cultural, and educational concerns of the Jewish community. They are usually led by a founder, an individual who sort of created and marketed an idea, and then have been supported and nurtured by many foundations and donor base that has been distinctive from the federated or communal or even synagogue base. So it is a different model of organizing. It tends to be bottom up. It tends to be very entrepreneurial. And these organizations are contesting, in a sense, for power and play against the more legacy or traditional institutions. And this moment, that is the conflict associated with Gaza, has afforded them a particular role, both as supportive of Israel in some cases or opponents of Israel in others. Let's go to the next slide. I think at this moment and beyond, these 8 principles will drive where and how the community will want to move forward, assuming that there is, at some point here, the resolution of the Gaza conflict. But in reality, the Gaza conflict has now metastasized into a conflict with Hezbollah. It now sees itself with certainly the arch of reaching toward Iran and other problem areas associated with Iranian influence in the region. So whether we are able to come to this moment of sort of revisiting outcomes and closure may be premature. But let's, for a moment, look at what we have learned this past year and what this may tell us about our moving forward. I mean, I think the very first item is going to be American Jewish educational practice around how do we teach Israel? How do we understand Zionism? And how do we reintroduce the history of the Middle East? Because in that context, we are seeing a significant absence of information, context, and community. And as a result, I think education becomes the next major priority of the community in trying to plan ahead for generational practice beyond Gen Zs. The second, of course, is rebuilding partnerships and advocacy, and even in dialogue with groups across the spectrum who differ with us. But this will be a longer-term community relations strategy of reorganizing ourselves in ways that we will not be isolated and alone, but will create a system of community building. The planning and preparedness factor here is that in crisis management situations, the Jewish community has learned a great deal about these last 13 months. And the question will be how we import that into planning for our future. And no doubt this will be a period of memorializing the losses of Israelis, the losses in particular of the hostages and those that have perished, and of the losses of Palestinians who in some measure were caught as victims of much of this conflict. So we see a series of efforts to put in context how we will deal with the losses of so many in such a short time. There are certainly economic and structural challenges ahead, and part of that is tied to security. The Jewish community today is providing more security to its institutions than at any time in its history. The cost factor for that security apparatus will be a major long-term issue that will require serious consideration of the role that the government will play, the role that the Jewish community and its institutions will need to play in both managing this security and dealing with the structural challenges associated with it. And in some measure, we will be rebuilding community in the sense of relationship building. The disconnects between us and amongst us, including our generational disconnects, will be a core piece to moving us forward. And this will also be about rethinking our priorities and our political interests, especially in a new administration, and what that may portend in terms of the future of U.S.-Israel relations, the role of Israel in the Middle East, and the decisions that the United States will make in terms of its broader policy implications for that region. Let's move on. I mean, here in our communities, very specifically, it is very much important that our institutions realize that many members and many people in our community feel very isolated at this point. The sense of being part of something, the sense of belonging to something larger than their own family or personal units is going to be an extraordinary responsibility on the part of our communal and religious institutions, because this will be the task of many Jews who are actually fearful. We have some data points from the American Jewish Committee study that suggests that over 50% of American Jews are concerned about being in the public square, of wearing Judaica on their bodies in any public space, a sense of feeling that we need to make holistic and safe the public arenas for Jewish gatherings. I think that many American Jews have come out of this and out of the elections that we've just held with a very different perspective of what they are looking for and what they will be requiring in terms of the fight against anti-Semitism, of rebuilding the case for Zionism, and of dealing with the significant challenges in asserting Israel's well-being moving forward. But I would remind you that at no time since the founding of the Jewish state have Americans given up on Israel. Indeed, in the most recent poll, 74% of Americans indicate a favorable attitude towards Israel. And while 41% may have difficulties with the current government of Israel, the overriding and abiding interest of America in Israel as a partner to the United States rests in both political parties at this moment. The last question on this slide is an interesting one, and I am currently teaching a course tied to this particular theme based on an article written in The Atlantic by Malcolm Four, where in a sense he is suggesting, is this a kind of closure point to the extraordinary rise, influence, and growth of American Jewish life at a time where at this moment we see a number of warning signals that this could be in jeopardy. My sense here is that this is a transition moment, and that I'm not certain that we would declare ourselves in a kind of difficult or problematic state as American Jews. But I do believe that there are particular challenges that we will need to address and that we now face. Let's move forward. There is a picture of Beth Israel. And I'm happy to include that because in some measure, what this slide is suggesting is the larger questions, the questions that every synagogue, every community must deal with at some point. Because are we on the brink of a much larger set of conflicts? And how will we as a community be able to prepare ourselves and prepare our children for what that may look like. And then we come to the questions, as we've raised earlier, about generations, and more directly, the impact of this election. And finally, on the concerns we have about how we define community today, even as we may differ or disagree around specifics and relationships with either Israel or some of the other sidebar issues associated with this conflict. I think that is the closing slide, and I look forward now to taking your questions and going deeper into the conversations based on some of this material and your own inquiries.
Thank you, Dr. Windmueller. And I just wanted to share with you that just before Rosh Hashanah, Franklin Foer spoke at our congregation about the issue of the end of the American century. It was a fascinating talk and a lot of conversation back and forth on that. So it's something that we've been wrestling with directly.
Excellent. Thank you.
There was a comment in the chat that JVP was not that Jewish Voices for Palestine, but rather Jewish Voices for Peace.
For peace. Peace. Sorry, my mistake. Yes.
Oh, okay. But in fact, what is their stance?
I mean, they have felt that Israel has overreacted, and they're critical of U.S. support for Israel, and they have galvanized student groups and others in opposition to support for Israeli actions. And so that has put them, in a sense, on the outside of the camp of supporters who may disagree with Israel, but because of their hardline positions, have sort of placed them as a part of the opposition.
I also have a question. You talked about the divisions among American Jews and different generations of American Jews. What I don't have a sense of is where the American population in general stands on this topic. I mean, yes, we hear about some of the extreme groups, but I'm just curious if there's any data you've found on that.
Yes, so two data points. One is an American Jewish Committee study that was done, I think, several years ago, dealing with non-Jewish attitudes about Jews and Judaism, finding an extraordinary degree of favorability towards Jews. And we'll come back to that one in a minute. But the second piece to that study having to do with are Americans concerned about anti-Semitism? And there again, we saw a very large number of Americans, well over the majority, articulating their support for the fact that they were deeply troubled by the acceleration of hate against American Jews. American Judaism is the most favorable religious community of any religious group in the United States, meaning Americans were asked in a study, if you were not of your particular faith tradition, what community or faith tradition would you seek to join, or do you marvel at and find favor with them? And American Judaism is and continues to be historically the highest ranked of these faith communities. So I point these out only to remind us that even as we face these extraordinary challenges from various forces within the United States and elsewhere, the overriding perception of Jews in the United States is still very favorable.
There is a question in the chat about why does the debate about Zionism continues. Is it a debate about Zionism, or is it really just a debate about the actions of the Israeli government? I'm kind of over-interpreting that question.
Yeah. Well, I think we have two debates. For some people, it's about this government and its behaviors or policies, and how the government understands its Zionist identity, which is different, by the way, from what many American Jews perceive as their Zionist identity. And then there is the larger critique coming to us from the university world and the postmodernist circle, who basically perceive Zionism as a colonialist idea, Israel as an imposition in the Middle East of a foreign entity placed there by the superpowers and by a post-Second World War effort. And therefore, they discredit both the product, Zionism, and they discredit the actions taken by the winning powers during the post-Second World War era in establishing the Jewish state. And for them, Zionism reeks with all of the negativity that I've described. It's seen as colonialist, apartheid, racist, and is, as they would articulate, from the river to the sea, as an argument that there's no place in the Middle East for a Jewish state.
Well, there is a kind of a challenge here for you, Professor, from one of our listeners, who feels that Israel, has with the bombing in Gaza, essentially has really overreacted, and he challenges you to deal with the implications of the destruction of Palestinian society that's going on. Gaza, when you see pictures in the news reels, Gaza is just rubble, and the society is in tatters.
Yeah, no question that this has been a major disruption and destruction of the infrastructure of Gaza. The difficulty here for the Israelis, at least this is their argument, is that the terrorist units of Hamas embedded themselves in hospitals and schools and mosques and in the mix of the population base of the area, leaving the Israelis with limited options in terms of how to access and to manage this conflict. And no doubt, the opponents of that view have argued that this was an action that was clearly well beyond the necessities of what ought to have taken place. The difficulties here are that I, for one, have not been to Gaza since the outbreak of this conflict, and certainly don't have a firsthand accounting of all that has happened and all of the justifications of the Israelis in this regard. And the second is that we have a very different kind of government in Israel than we've had ever in the past. And it is a right-of-center government with a very distinctive ideology and Zionist philosophy that we need to understand, whether we support it or disagree with it. And its perception is that the only way to change the status quo is to win. In other words, the prime minister's words are that total victory, and that's his quote, total victory is an essential outcome in this conflict. And he believes the only way to achieve that is through the means that the IDF has employed over these past 13 months.
Most of
Meredith,
what
I'm
we
sorry.
yeah,
Susan,
go
if you
ahead,
don't
Rabbi.
mind just adding one point, and appreciate if you could comment on it. The ongoing protests against this government do they are they an indication of the Israeli community's displeasure with the prosecution of the war, or are they other issues?
So there are two issues that we have some polling data on of Israelis. 52% of Israelis indicate that they are not happy with the conduct of this war. And an additional number of Israelis, larger than 52, I'm looking here for the particulars, but more importantly is this larger number is deeply concerned that there's no hostage deal. And for them, the hostage rescue is ultimately core to the success or vindication of this conflict. So there's no doubt that the government probably is not receiving the kind of support that it would want from its own constituents. And the rallies that have been held from time to time against the government, especially on the hostage question, sort of speaks to some of that. Since the prime minister is not forced to call an election, because as you know, under the parliamentary system Israel has constructed, unless there is a vote of no confidence, and he holds 64 of the 120 seats, that is his coalition. And if that coalition holds, he does not have to seek re-election for a 5-year period. So that's still several years away for there to be any threat to this existing government to be altered or overturned.
There's another comment here about Netanyahu, that it's been reported his military advisors have told him that total victory is not realistic.
Yes.
But Netanyahu continues with the strategy.
Yeah.
I mean, we read because it protects him politically. Do you want to
Yeah.
speak to that?
Well, as you know, this past week he fired his defense minister, and part of that was precisely this point of total victory, where the prime minister believes that this is the outcome he's seeking and wants to achieve, and where there were differences with the IDF leadership, the Israel Defense Force leadership, over that definition and over that outcome. So this is a matter that is not only being challenged by Israeli public, but is being challenged internally between the government and its military leadership.
What is the definition of total victory?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I've looked for the prime minister's statement on that, and he's never really defined or framed what that might include.
Rabbi, did you have any other comments or questions? Oh, wait, there is one more message here. The question is specifically, what role does Netanyahu's legal problems play in the ongoing pursuit of war?
Yes, I mean, the supposition is that if he were to step down, that he would face some potential jail time. And so the cynical view here is the longer he permits this war to continue, the less chance of his facing a criminal indictment and time behind bars. So that is a sidebar, but very important one to this whole story. We have some interesting data about the election here in the United States in terms of this issue of Gaza and Israel's military actions. What we identified is that we have two conflicting polls. Why not at least two? One suggests that something on the order of 32% of American Jews voted for Donald Trump in last Tuesday. But what's more interesting about that is that when the exit polling was done by the Associated Press and Fox News, we got some really interesting data and especially some interesting outcomes differing where you live. So for one of the first times in American Jewish history, we have some distinctive voting behaviors that we see in metropolitan New York and South Florida that doesn't compare to what we are seeing and what we saw in Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and other states, which were particularly significant because of the fact that they were viewed as purple or in play. And the distinction here is that we see what we call the single issue voter emerging among 44% of voters in New York and South Florida, where these voters said that anti-Semitism in Israel drove their decision to support Donald Trump. Now, while other voters may have said similar things, um, this was a much more accelerated number, that 44%. So this is Nassau County, which is Long Island. This is Westchester, Rockland County, which is a highly Orthodox area around Muncie. This is an area of Passaic County, New Jersey, highly Orthodox. This is part of South Florida where we have significant numbers of both new voters. When I say new voters, these are Americans who have more recently come to the United States from Israel, from Latin America, from Iran. Of course, Iranians already second and in some cases third generation, and certainly from other parts of the world. Because Florida has a very high number of new Americans as in total, and in the Jewish sector, it's an interesting byplay to this election. So one of the particular outcomes here is that this war would draw some significant support, at least in some of the areas that we now have strong data to suggest that this was supportive of Donald Trump's position.
I'll try to summarize some of this. I'm having a tough time summarizing some of these comments, but there was one. I mean, there were a lot of folks who, as horrified as they are with what happened on October 7th, are also horrified at so much of the impact on the folks in Gaza. And is that just something that we focus on as Jews, or is there a wider audience or wider perception of that, both here and elsewhere? We've been talking a lot about reactions of Americans, but what about European Jews and South American Jews and so elsewhere in the world?
Interestingly enough, American Jews tend to be much more balanced or critical in their thinking. The global Jewish scene has a much tighter linkage to the Israel government position. So I was just in South Africa. The South African Jewish communities very strongly, overwhelmingly supportive of the prime minister, of the IDF, of Israel's military actions. Yes, there are certainly small segments of South African Jews. They were demonstrating actually at one of our progressive synagogues to reflect their unhappiness. But the reality is what we see in Latin America, what we see in Europe and elsewhere, is a kind of connection to Israel that is very different from the American model. And its linkage, the linkages there are tied to long-standing ties to sort of towing the Israel line, if you wish, which we don't see as Americans, because we are, in a sense, the mindset of Americans is to ask questions, is to challenge, is to think about, and even raise oppositional points of view. So this is a very different frame that I think we see evolving in the American Jewish community, and it's been present for a very long period. I mean, this is not the first descent on Israel. In 1982, Israel's war in Lebanon would be the first occasion where we would begin to see a significant number of American Jews question Israeli policy in that war, where Ariel Sharon conducted the events around that conflict. So there is a distinction amongst the global Jewish communities, and we need to identify and acknowledge that. And the second is, we are not the only community where these kinds of issues are in play, meaning there are huge pushback, as we know, from audiences beyond the Jewish community about what they perceive as the excesses of Israeli actions. So this is a phenomenon that has tentacles well beyond simply American Jewish opposition or concern.
What about,
can I, Susan, I'm sorry,
yeah, go ahead, Rabbi, I'm
a
sorry.
moment? And I told you could do all of the question and answer, Susan, so forgive me for jumping. But I want to summarize a comment from one of our commentators, but it builds on something that you just said, Dr. Windmueller. The fact that that Israel as the element that has divided the Jewish community is, as you say, not something that happened on October 7th. Or we should, well, the truth is the criticism of Israel did not begin on October 7th, or with Israel's actions in Gaza. It's been going on for some time. The question, though, is that division, the fact of that criticism coming from within the Jewish community, we'll leave the rest of the world out for a moment, has created a sense for many of these critics as being marginalized by the organized Jewish community, particularly, I would say, the legacy community that you spoke about earlier. And of course, that kind of division within the Jewish community is pretty complicated, and I think is concerning for the future of Judaism. Can you tell us a little bit about the observations that you've had about that historically, and what do we do as a Jewish community, particularly when we are facing anti-Semitism? Can we afford to have a part of our community feeling marginalized?
Yeah, I mean, one of the great case studies here has been the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. It's 54 organizations, most of whom are legacy. Efforts to seat J Street in the conference failed. 18 of the organizations seeking to allow for J Street to be admitted. And yet the majority of these legacy groups voting against such a move. Now, this occurred some years ago, but the point being that there is no place at the tables of core discussion, and the conference is but one symbol, it's a national symbol, but these are prevalent even on college campuses, whether Hillel is able to build a wide enough tent to include groups that are critical of Israel, and then often that doesn't happen, or in communities where there are groups who differ from the mainstream institutions of our federated system. And this is creating a kind of sense of being outside, as you suggest, this sort of isolation. And ultimately, this is highly problematic. And what it has led to is, I interviewed an individual 2 weeks ago who said to me, I am a non-Zionist, but I am a rabbi. And I said, so your your work, your role is to deal with everything but Israel in your context as a rabbinic voice. And he said, yes. Um, and he said, there's no space for me because my views on Israel are challenging to the mainstream. And so rather than try to fight that, I sort of operate outside of the parameters of the traditional or the boundaries of traditional communal systems. Because there are folks like me and audiences like me that have no place to be heard. So I think the Jewish community has a significant struggle before it in terms of the fact that at the moment we are in the sense reading out or eliminating those folks from any kind of formal integrative conversation. I know the supporters of the idea that you need to be pro-Israel, you need to defend Israel, you need to only um, have the minimalist of a dissent. That perspective may have played well 30 to 50 years ago, but in a society as diverse and as assimilated and shifting as ours, I suspect that that's no longer going to be an acceptable outcome.
I was just sort of following on your comments about the old line Jewish organizations. Are um, any of them at all talking about the divisiveness in the Jewish community over Gaza, or is it just silence?
I think they pay lip service to the reality that there is division, but they tend to remain pretty much centered on their positions. It is interesting that 160 young Jewish professionals from Jewish organizations that are part of that established mainstream wrote a letter to their bosses collectively saying that they were troubled by the kind of uniformity of thinking and the absence of diversity that was present in a community where we know there are divisions and we know that there is dissent. And as young Jewish professionals, they were mournful and disturbed that the community was not more robust in being able to incorporate or include these voices. And they were not happy with their own agency's decisions in some of these matters in terms of being more nuanced than they have been.
Okay. Well, thank you, Professor Windmueller.
I think we've all become more
I think
depressed.
we've challenged you.
That's okay. I don't want people to go totally depressed. I want folks to realize that there's something actually rather extraordinary that's happening. I mean, the fact that the Jewish community is grappling with these questions, and even if we are not always being heard, or that the voices that sit outside are not always welcome, um, that the communal system is ultimately going to be changed and and impacted by what we are seeing and what is happening, and that the generations that follow will likely rethink the ways by which we build consensus or build community, taking into account that we are going to be a very different fifth generation American Jewish community than we have been in the past.
Thank you. Um, I, I just, yeah, Rabbi, did you want to have a few final words?
Thank you. No, I appreciate your framing is really excellent, and the challenges that I think we're facing um, are have been building, as you say, for quite some time. I think what we've really found is the definitions of what's inside and what's outside are shifting quite a bit. And I think that there's a real challenge right now because people's views are not necessarily articulated in a clear manner. I think that um, the we talked about mainstream legacy organizations and those kinds of organizations versus the kind of startup entrepreneurial organizations that we saw in the beginning of the 21st century. And we haven't really quite come to grips with what that difference is going to be. But I think that most of the organizations are at least within the bounds of uh, Israel has a right to exist, which is actually really called into question today.
Yeah.
The settler colonialist narrative is in its in its definition does not believe that Israel has a right to exist. Its sin is in its very existence, and when you have that as the challenge, it tends to make even mainline or mainstream organizations become very reactive because any critique is, are you saying that Israel doesn't have a right to exist? And we define that as anti-Semitism. So it becomes hard to have the conversations, I think is what I'm trying to say. The extremes have defined the parameters of the conversation, and it makes everything very hard to come together. I think we want to be able to, as we've talked about in a large organization in Portland, compassion for Palestinians, for the incredible devastation that's happened to them through no fault of their own. This is the Hamas's responsibility, and Israel's right to defend itself and to exist against an existential crisis. And where is the balance in those two values?
Yes. Absolutely. And I think that the point you make about the extremes defining the boundaries and the territorial conscript of this is really key to this whole debate. Well, thank you very much for inviting me in.
Yeah,
Thank you
well,
so much, Dr. Windmueller.
thank you. The really challenging and difficult topic.
Yes.
We have another
An easier
presentation.
one next time. We'll
Oh,
talk
here
about
we go.
we'll talk about Donald Trump and
All
American
right.
freedom. That'll be a much easier one for us.
We have another guest coming next week on, I think at least I hope it's going to have no controversy attached to it. But a group of speakers from the Jewish National Fund
USA.
will be here next Tuesday evening. The JNF is doing a collaborative project with a Bedouin community in the Negev, and a couple of members of that community will be with us next Tuesday evening, 7 o'clock in Poland Chapel, but will also be live streamed. So I hope people will be able to join us for that. I think it will be a little bit more uplifting next week. But Professor Windmueller, you've given us a lot to think about. I really appreciate.
I want to say about that presentation next week. I've unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to be there. I'll be out of town, but I did have an opportunity to visit Wadi Atir, and the two leaders who are coming from that community will be speaking to us. It's a fascinating place. The Bedouin community has really not been treated well by by successive Israeli governments. And this investment that JNF USA, different than JNF or Karen Kayemet, they're separate orders, that's another story. But the investments that JNF USA has made into this community in the Negev is really interesting and important. And I think I encourage people to come hear about that. Thank you so much,
Okay.
Dr. Windmueller. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. All right.
Have a good
Thank you.
Good
evening.
night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.